Senator Coyle. It's on debate.
Honourable colleagues, I rise today to speak in support of Motion 54, Senator Bernard and Senator Lankin's motion to strike a Senate Special Committee on Racism, and I'm honoured to be doing this on the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. The Parliamentary Black Caucus issued a powerfully important statement last week which outlined concrete actions it is asking government to undertake. Unfortunately, when Senatrice Meji asked for permission for that statement to be tabled in the Senate last week, although clearly supported by the strong voices of the majority of our colleagues, permission was denied. I know many of us found that refusal to be both disappointing and disrespectful. Our colleagues in the Senate Indigenous Working Group have come out in support of their Senate colleagues of African descent, Senators Bernard, Meji, Moody, Ravalia, and Jaffer, who have been working hard as members of the Parliamentary Black Caucus and have come forward with this important motion. This effort to create a special committee, combined with the powerful emergency debate last week and the Committee of the Whole on Racism planned for later this week, are concrete actions our colleagues have spearheaded to guide and direct us to more actions leading to the results we all want to see. So why do I and why should we all support this motion to strike this special committee to conduct a review of systemic racism in Canada and identify priorities and recommendations for government action to combat anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Black racism, and systemic racism? The first and obvious reason is that our colleagues with lived experience and expertise are asking us to. We should demonstrate our trust in them, and we should follow their lead, just as we should follow the lead of their peers in the broader Canadian society. Honourable colleagues, 3 years ago this month, having just completed some really tough cancer treatments, I was attending a Living Beyond Cancer session. Boy, that was a different time. One of the wise resource people at the session was a chaplain named David McGinley. He gave us two challenges. The first one was to make sure we were living the life we had worked so hard to have. And the second, which is the relevant point for this discussion, was to not waste the crisis. Honourable colleagues, the crises caused by colonialism, discrimination, exploitation, and the related racism have been with us for centuries. In fact, our mainstream society has been benefiting from these crises. Our country was built on these crises. We have the Indian Act, land dispossession of the original peoples of this territory, disenfranchisement. We have thousands of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. We have the impacts of residential schools. We had racially segregated schools. We moved African Nova Scotians around with no respect for their tenancy rights. We relocated Inuit people to unfamiliar lands and left them to die. We have Indigenous people and Canadians of African descent populating our prisons in disproportionately high numbers. We have them targeted by police, and some even killed or have died during wellness checks. We have a whole variety of uneven social and economic outcomes for Indigenous people and Canadians of African descent. We had crises in Canada long before George Floyd was murdered by the Minneapolis police and before Chantal Moore, Rodney Levy, and Régis Courchency-Paquette lost their lives, and the recent mass Black Lives Matter protests brought millions of people out in their communities across Canada, in the US, and around the world. But this current crisis, intersecting with the public health crisis brought on by COVID-19, is a moment we should not waste. Our colleagues calling for the establishment of the Senate Special Committee on Racism are telling us that the time is now. These recent crises have brought about a tipping point in collective consciousness, and we need to act before this moment is squandered. In her speech from the throne opening this 43rd Parliament, Governor-General Julie Payette said, and I quote, "Whether we are from here or choose to come and live here, we share the same desire. We wish to live freely and in peace and harmony. This quest is a bedrock of our nation and informs almost everything we do. Your role as parliamentarians, that means our role, in the democratic process is a privilege and a responsibility. We serve every single Canadian, Canadians of all genders, faiths, languages, customs, or skin colors. If we put our brains and smarts and altruistic capabilities together, we can do a lot of good. We can help improve the lives in our communities, diminish the gaps and inequities here and elsewhere. End of quote. Colleagues, as senators, we have a responsibility to ensure that all people in Canada have opportunities to share in both shaping our country and enjoying the bounty that many of us take for granted. In order to achieve this, we must understand once and for all and find effective ways to fulfill the promise implicit in the statements, Black Lives Matter. Indigenous lives matter. We must listen, we must follow, we must insist on action, and we must hold ourselves and others accountable. Senator Lankin and others have pointed out the abundance of excellent studies and reports that exist that are overflowing with well-formulated recommendation, call to action, calls to justice, which have still not been brought into action. These will be central resources for the Senate Special Committee. Our colleague, Senator Mary Jane McCallum, advised us in her letter dated June 18th, and I quote Senator McCallum, "It is change, real change that we need. I do not feel that the racism faced by Indigenous peoples and the racism faced by the Black community should be considered under one catch-all umbrella. Approaching racism with a pan-minority approach will only cause further pain." End of quote. By the same token, it will be important to differentiate within each group as well. We know that from the Indigenous Languages Act we passed last year, while it was a positive step forward, it did not recognize the highly differentiated reality of the Inuit and their Inuktitut language. Hear, hear. We know that the realities of African Nova Scotians living in the 3 historic rural settlements in my part of Nova Scotia live vastly different lives from the realities of the largely Black immigrant populations of Montreal or Toronto. We must differentiate. Ibram Kendi, Guggenheim Fellow, founding director of the Anti-Racist and Policy Center at American University, and author of Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, turns this conversation on the origins of racism and its remedies on their heads. He says, education, love, and exemplary Black people will not deliver America from racism. Racist ideas grow out of discriminatory policies, not the other way around. Well, not everyone will agree with Mr. Kendi, and I believe it isn't either or. Our colleague, Senator Murray Sinclair, former Chief Commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, has been quoted as saying, "Education has gotten us into this mess, and education will get us out." However, Ibram Kendi goes on to say, and I quote, "The goal is to identify inequalities, identify the policies that create and maintain those inequalities, and propose corrections." And he mentions 6 areas for those: criminal justice, education, economics, health, environment, and politics. Ibram Kendi's book makes the case that the actual foundation of racism is not ignorance and hate, but rather self-interest, particularly economic, political, and cultural. While Ibram Kendi is largely speaking about the foundations of anti-Black racism in the US, there are certainly some relevant comparisons in Canada worthy of examining. On a related point, but with a rather different, twist, let's consider the story of a river. Picture the river, folks. Picture yourself standing on the edge of the Ottawa River out behind our old historic chamber on Parliament Hill. All of a sudden, a flailing, drowning child comes floating by. Without thinking, you jump in the river and pull the child to shore, and before you can recover, another child is in distress and comes floating by, so you dive in and you rescue her. And then another child comes floating by, and another, and another. Eventually, hopefully, some wise person will ask, who keeps chucking these kids in the river? And they will head upstream to find out. This is a simple illustration employed by the Upstream Institute for a Healthy Society, which recently joined forces with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. In the case of Canada, we need to ask ourselves, whose babies are drowning in the river? They're not my little pink and white middle-class ones. Why are those babies there, and in such large numbers? And finally, what are we doing about it? As we strike this critical Senate Special Committee on Racism, let's try to make sure that we don't continue to suffer from what the Institute calls downstream thinking, but rather let's help the mainstream look upstream. While we can't ignore the downstream where we find far too many of our fellow racialized Canadians, let's ask the committee to look at what urgent, smart policies and investments, remember Senator Omidvar made the important point about following the money, what could be put in place upstream? Honourable colleagues, we allow ourselves to start to look past this pandemic lockdown period, our Prime Minister, other societal leaders, and many Canadians are talking about building back better, building back greener, and building back fairer. Racism, with its many deadly manifestations in our society, is a national shame and can no longer be tolerated if we truly want to build Canada back better and fairer. Black Canadians, Indigenous peoples, and other racialized Canadians are telling us they are tired of the status quo. They are tired of carrying the burden. They have had enough. Haven't we, as parliamentarians, all had enough too? Striking the Senate Special Committee on Racism with a robust mandate and populated with our capable colleagues is an important action I hope we can all get behind. Moses Cody, the namesake of the institute I used to work at, once said, "In a democracy, the people don't sit in the social and economic bleachers. They all play the game." Honourable colleagues, let's support Senator Lankin and Senator Bernard's motion, and let's make sure that once and for all we have everyone engaged in our democracy and benefiting fairly from it, no matter what color their skin is or who their ancestors were. Let's exercise our privilege and responsibility. Let's not let more drowning babies continue to float downstream. Honourable senators, let's not waste this crisis. Colleagues, let's do the right thing. Thank you. Merci. Walalio.